Yeah, but it's all good. So let's introduce the next talk today. The next speaker is Derick Rethans, one of my friends and people I love to hang out with when we finally get back to conferences in person. Derick's PHP internals expert, author of the Xdebug extension, which you should definitely be using if you're not. Let's not get into that whole controversy again, Derick. And he's an OpenStreetMap and mapping enthusiast. You may have heard of Derick's extensions like Xdebug and the Datetime. And Derick's going to talk to us today about what's new in PHP 8.1. So yeah, let's bring Derick onto the stage. Hello, hello, hello. You did unmute yourself, Derick. You didn't make the faux pas that I did, so that's all good.
Actually, I was muted when I came on, but it automatically unmuted me, so it's not even me.
How are you doing? I haven't seen you in forever, and we definitely used to hang out a lot at events. So how's things and how are you doing?
So I'm fine. It's just bored of things not being normal. I much rather prefer to be in Verona with you all today.
Oh, I know, Verona. PHPday, one of my favorite conferences to get over to Verona, especially when the weather's like this. You know, we've had some nice days here in the UK. That would have been drinking Aperol Spritz by the pool. Yeah, it's a shame. But next year, maybe, yeah?
Yep, so I have to do it here with the elephants helping me out.
Awesome. Mm-hmm. So yeah, you're working freelance at the moment, so you're available for hire, which is always good news to know.
Yeah, but plenty busy. So that's
right. Okay, so don't tell people that.
No. There's always more things I can do, but at the moment I'm quite happy and doing some contracts, and then the rest of my time spending actually on Xdebug, which is
awesome.
A nice thing to do. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the conversations around the recent innovation of Xdebug is a conversation all on its own. So we don't really have time to go into that today. But yeah, so you've pre-recorded your talk, what's new in PHP 8.1. So let's play that out. And if you've got any questions, ask them in the Q&A pane, and we'll come back to Derick with your questions after the video.
Yeah, and feel free to heckle because it's recorded, I don't mind. Hello and good morning. Welcome to this presentation about what's new in PHP 8.1. Before we start, I have to add that it isn't quite 100% sure yet what is going to make it into PHP 8.1 because feature freeze hasn't happened yet. And in this last month, up until feature freeze happens, often many things still change. Whenever a feature hasn't made it into PHP 8.1 yet, I have marked the slides with drafts. I am pretty certain that most of these things will actually make it in, but no guarantees. Having said that, let's dive straight in. A few words about myself. Hi, I'm Derick, currently living in London. It's very nice and sunny here. Unfortunately, I'm not there with you in Verona, which I've always enjoyed visiting quite a lot. I'm PHP 7.4's release manager. You might also know me because of my work on Xdebug. If you don't yet, please Google that. I also host a podcast called PHP Internals News, where I talk with the developers of the PHP language about all the new features that they're proposing to introduce. And as such, I have spoken to all of the proposers of all the features that I'm going to go through with you this morning. I also like maps, beer and whiskey, and some of my examples will very likely feature one of these things. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me in the chat, because of course this is a recorded session. And later, please also feel free to hassle me on Twitter at DerickR. All right. PHP isn't made by just one person, of course. It is made by many people, and every release cycle has release managers. So for PHP 8.1, they are Patrick Allard and Ben Ramsey. They pretty much do the same work as I'm doing for PHP 7.4, which is the packaging of the releases. Now, the release managers don't really have need to have a very deep technical knowledge, but they do need to be able to herd all the developers together to make sure that we're getting our releases out on time and without any bugs in there. So yes, good luck to Patrick and Ben, I would say, because there's quite a lot of things happening in PHP 8.1. The first thing adds a little bit to what has been a continuous trend over the last 3 to 4 years, which is making PHP more typed. And one of the bigger additions in PHP 8.1 is going to be a new Enum type, which is a data type consisting of a set of named values. If you're familiar with other languages, enums are there, of course, as well. Now, the PHP implementation introduces a new keyword called enum. In this case, I've created the currency enumeration with 2 cases in there, GBP for the Great British Pound and EUR for the euro. You define the values that are allowed on an enum with the case keyword. Now the backend of enums are actually classes, and you will see that in some of my examples. When I display an enum, it will actually still say class because I haven't updated Xdebug yet to make sure that it knows that an enum is a special case of a class. But because the base of an enum is a class, pretty much everything that would work with a class, or you would expect to work with a class, would also work exactly the same for an enumeration. That's interfaces, types, etc., etc. Now, this is the most basic enum that we have here, and we can use it as follows. So I've defined a class product, and in its constructor, we're having 3 arguments, and there we are using the PHP 8 style of constructed promoted properties. So we have 3 private properties, the name, the amount, as well as the currency, and we define that here with the enum currency, just as we would do a class type here. Now, each of these cases, the GBP and the EUR, you can access by using the static resolution operator. What this actually is, the value that this actually is a class. It's an object. It's a static object specifically created for this currency. So when you have the enum currency with the 2 cases GBP and EUR, it will actually create 2 static objects that will not change, and there's also only always going to be one for them. Pretty much what what this is. And it then has values in there. So let me do the var dump here. I shall ignore the first 2 elements here. So chili and the 5.5, the price for the chili elephant. But you see that the 3rd element, the currency one, is of class currency. That should be enum, but Xdebug doesn't know that yet. And it has a public string name, which is EUR. So for each of the cases, there will be created a separate internal object that you can access by using this double dot operator. So in this case, yes, it has EUR as a name. Now, because we have typed against the currency enum here, if you pass in a string, then what you would expect is, of course, you get an error message, a type error in this case, because we are passing a string in instead of one of the classes that are the subtypes of the currency enumeration. So the currency .gbp and the currency .eur actually subclasses of the currency enum class, to say. Which means that all your typing works as expected. So in this case, we can't just send in the string. We need to do currency double double dot GBP or EUR. Now, it is possible that beyond the standard simple case enums, that you can also have backed enums. And you define that by setting a specific type on the enum. In this case, I have used string, but you can also use int. And in this case, you can attach values to these cases. Now, these values, they have to be of the exact same type as what you're passing in, or what you have defined as a type for the enum, in this case, string. So for GBP, I use the pound sign, and for euro, I use the euro sign. Now, again, when we then create a product where we say currency GBP and we do a var dump, you'll see that not only do we have a GBP here, but we also have the value. Now, you can do some interesting things with these values. Okay, so go back to our implementation, our enum. So you can actually access the value property on this enum classes, as it was, because currency : EUR is a object. Objects can have values. In this case, you can access the value here from the euro, from the EUR case, and that then returns the euro sign. You can also create an enumeration class from this value. So in this case, we're doing currency : whatever you want to call that, from, and then you can specify the backed value, which in this case is the pound sign, and then what you get back here is the currency enum class for GBP. If in some cases you don't actually know upfront which what the backed values are, so in this case we're trying to create a currency from the dollar sign. Of course, we don't have a dollar sign. So if you would use from and then dollar sign, you get an exception because it doesn't exist. But sometimes you want to be a bit more careful here. So there's an additional method called try from, in which you can basically dump everything. And as long as you put in something that doesn't exist as a backed value, you get null back, or otherwise you get the correct currency class back, which can be a nice way of doing this. Now, there's a whole bunch of other things. So enumerations can actually have functions attached to them, pretty much like a class can have methods. And these methods are available on each of the sub-enum classes that come out of currency. So currency GBP and currency EUR. Now, it's quite a common thing to use the match expression here. So what I've written here is I've written a format function that you give it an amount in, and then it returns you the format that is expected to go with this currency. Now, if you want to do this the correct way, you need to use the intel classes with all the correct locales, but this is just a simple example to show you what I'm doing here. So the format method on the currency enum checks what subclass it is by matching against this. And if it's GBP, we do the backed value first, which you can access with this with value, as you have seen in an earlier slide, and then the amount. And if it's a currency euro, then we do the number and then the sign afterwards. So when I now run this with this script, if we say in currency GBP and then format it with the number 4275, we get pound sign 4275 back. Beyond having a normal class method, you can also have static methods, and these can be handy to as a factory method. So for example, we give it a locale, and depending on the locale, we then get a currency type back. So that's what I'm doing here. So we're doing, for example, for Dutch in the Netherlands, we return a euro. For Italy, we do the euro. And for UK GB, which is actually Ukraine, but should have been EN, we return the Great British Pound. So, and you use this as an alternative constructor. In a similar way, if we now call from locale, using IT for Italian, then we get the euro back, and we show that by accessing the value property, which is of course the euro sign string. That's quite a lot in enumerations, and the RFC is even longer than this. Now, the last thing I want to show here is the value listing. So, getting back to our original currency enum definition, there's an additional method on it called cases, which returns a list of all these static objects that form the subclasses of currency. So in this case, we're getting back class currency for the definition for GBP with the backed value £, as well as the class currency for the euro with the name as well as its backed sign, euro sign. I believe enumerations is going to be a big, great feature, and I think it's useful in many cases where people now just hope everything works. And yeah, it allows you to model like a stricter data type to make sure you're not messing up pretty much, which is always in which I'm always in favor. All right, another big feature is something called fibers. And fibers is quite a tricky thing to explain what it is. So instead of talking about it, I will actually go step through it with a debugger to show what it is. But in the simplest explanation, it is cooperative multitasking, meaning that it is up for the different tasks to say when they're waiting for something, for example, a network read or a read from a file, and then hand over the execution to a different fiber. This is very similar to what Microsoft Windows 3.1 and 3.11 did. The tasks in there were, it wasn't true multitasking, a task couldn't interrupt other tasks, but it was like some kind of event loop where an application could say, well, I am now in a place where I'm waiting for something, and then another task takes over. So yes, PHP 8.1 goes back to Microsoft Windows 3.1, which is kind of funny. All right, so let's demo this. Let me switch to my debugger. All right, so what I'm having here is a class called event loop. The event loop is just a normal class, which is pretty much meant as a scheduler in some sort of ways. I won't go exactly into all the different lines what I do, but I will show you the general thing. All right, so I'll go back to this class in a moment. The main issue is pretty much here. So in line 50, we're creating a stream socket pair, which is a way in PHP to be able to communicate. In this case, we're using an IP protocol, but it doesn't particularly matter. Because fibers are all about cooperative multitasking, the idea is that all of the read and write operations that you do are all non-blocking operations. So that's what we're doing here with the streams. We set both the read and the write socket to non-blocking, so that if you read from it and there is no data, it doesn't wait until data is available, which is what its normal behavior is. We're just creating the event loop ourselves here. We instantiate it on line 60, and then here we define the fiber. So fiber is an object with the name fiber, with the class name fiber, and its sole argument is a function. In this case, we're using a closure, an unnamed function, where we use the variables loop, which is our event loop, and read, which is our read socket. So the idea is that we start this fiber, and only when data is available will it then continue running. And when I step through it, you'll see what happens there. We start the fiber, and when you start a fiber, it starts executing what's in here. So it does waiting for data. It accesses the current fiber. I know PHP Storm still bitches that it doesn't know what fiber is, because of course it hasn't been updated for PHP 8.1 yet. It defines like this read operation. So this read operation is basically, if we scroll up a little bit, what it does is it creates an ID. It adds the resource in here, which is what our read socket is going to be, and then has a callback for it. Basically, it adds to the event loop a thing saying that, well, if there's something to read, then we know which callback to call for it. And the callback here is, in this case, fiber resume, which is its current fiber and then resume. After after that has defined what it wants to do if there's something available on the read socket, it then suspends itself by using fiber suspend. And this then stops the execution of this fiber and hands it over to the next one in the list. And which one that is? In this case, that is the main body of the script, because the main body of your script is also a fiber. Although it's a special one, but that doesn't matter. So after the fiber started, it will automatically suspend itself. And then we call on the loop, we call defer. And defer is again, we push a task to this list. So in this case, it's an anonymous function with one statement in there that does write, fwrite to our write socket, and it says hello world. And then we run the event loop. Now, what run does is the following: is that if there are no callbacks, so as long as there are callbacks or read isn't empty, which is the read callbacks that we have, we call one. So in this case, defer, you remember what we did here, we added defer this function to it. So the first thing that it will do is call defer, which is then executing our write. And then we do select. Now, select is traditional way in Unix system programming to see whether there is something available on a socket. And if there is, handle it. If there's not, then we just return from the select. And yeah, that's basically how that goes. Now, if there's blocking data, then stream select will also block until data is available. But if you remember, we set all the streams to non-blocking. So that means that if there's no data, stream select immediately returns. And then that's what the select function then it returns. Now, of course, after we do the write, select won't be empty, because that means that because we have created a socket pair, there's actually something going to be available on the read socket. And then we can loop over this through our array of read elements that we have. Because the read here is an array of sockets, not a single socket, which is always a bit tricky to do. And this array has both an ID, which is what we created for every deferment that we do, with a resource, which is our actual socket. And then from this, it figures out whether we have any callbacks for the stream, which we should do because we've created one. And then it unsets that to make sure to remove it from our list, and then call our callback with our resource. And the callback, if you remember, is then the callback that we have set up here, which is fiber resume, which then means that it does the fread and shows that we received the data. And that's basically the end of our application, because we have no more deferred things. So let's step through that with our debugger. We run that, go to our first state, and it stops here at our first line where we have our read write, where we create our socket. So I'm going to step through this, and if there's something interesting, I'll mention it. As I mentioned, we now set unblocking. We start our event loop, which as long there's no constructor in there, so we don't do anything. We do define our fiber, and you can now see that there's a new variable fiber. And now we start a fiber, and I will step into this so that you can see what happens here. So first there's the echo, which isn't interesting. It's assigned to fiber, which again gets our fiber here. We add read to our loop. So let me step into that. Step into that, it adds this to our stream callbacks here. We should have here in stream callbacks, which is our closure that we've just created. And it has this fiber in there. And in read, we have our stream resource, which is what we wanted, right? Now, fiber calls suspend, and I'm not sure if you've seen this. Actually, in the stack trace, each fiber has its own stack trace, and unlike the top one being main, which is what we have for the main body of our script, Xdebug shows you like the fiber ID. which isn't something that you can make use of, but it is just a way to distinguish between different fibers if there are multiple. We're calling now fiber suspend, and that now means that we are no longer in our fiber, we are back in our main loop or in our main script, and that means that we now are back in main. Now we do the defer for the write, and I won't step into that, but now we do the loop run, and we step into this. So we step into this. It says, well, empty defer callbacks. Well, we can check that defer callbacks isn't empty. There's one element in there. And empty read isn't empty either because we have our string resource in there. Step over this. So defers, we set defer callback to empty because we've already figured out what it is. And then we loop over all the current defers that we have, which is in this case my fwrite, if you remember correctly. I don't think we can see that, but the write is for this resource. And then we call it. We can't step into that because it's a built-in function, so we have to step over that. So we have done that. It is now actually sent the fwrite on the socket, which is not something you can see here. And then we call select. So step into that. So timeout, we don't really care about this. We call our stream select, and read should now return something. This currently, we have this one read element in there, and once we have done this, we should see something. And indeed, read is still there. The way how stream select works is that you give it a list of all the sockets that you want to see, that you want to check for information. And then after stream select has finished, it only contains the sockets that have data on it. In this case, the stream that we have because we just done the fwrite on it. And then we can loop over this. We save the callback for a while. We remove them from our list because we're now handling that. Done it twice. And then we call the callback, which is our closure again, which is in our fiber. So let's step into that with our resource. And indeed, it now comes back to the fiber itself, and it is now going to run this fiber resume, which is what our callback is. We haven't quite switched to the fiber yet because we haven't called resume yet. However, resume is being called now, and then you'll see that we switch back to the fiber. We know for sure that there is data to read on the socket because the select told us so, and now we can read this data and echo it 3 times because echo is funny because it does the receives data first, then data, and then the /n. And then our fiber is finished. We have done what we wanted to do. We also jump out of the run function because the select now finished and there's nothing to do here anymore either. And then we finish our program. So that's in short fibers. Now this is of course a really simple example, but this is going to be very useful for big frameworks like AMP and things like that, that are built around this cooperative multitasking with non-blocking data. I don't think many of you would implement this yourselves, but this sort of shows how this works, and maybe you can come up with a good reason to start using fibers. So that's our Windows 3.1 implementation here. Now, we sort of have done all the big features in PHP 8.1. Now let's look at some slightly smaller ones. Some of them are cleaning up things that PHP does oddly. Now, a very long-running issue is with static variables. So I'm not talking about static class properties, but static variables, like we have here. I would say that the chance that you're using these isn't very high, but there is something strange going on here in PHP 8.0 and earlier, which is that if you have an extended class, it gets its own copy of the static variable. And that is confusing to say, because what I would expect is to say is 1, 2, 3, 4. Every time we call counter, we increase this value here once, right? And there's nothing special in here, so why would it do 1, 2, 1, 2 as well? Because we call the counter on the B class, which has its own copy of static I. PHP 8.1 will fix that so that you get the expected result. Sorry. That's 27-ish, where I need to do some. And so yeah, we get the correct result here. That means that all the static variables are now always going to be by its definition, which in this case it's only defined in class A, so that's what it will stay, and there won't be an extra copy in extended classes. If you had a function counter with a static I in a trait, then and had class A and B both making use of the trait, then there would be a separate copy, because class A and class B won't have a relationship between them. They're just implementing the trait, and in that case, because traits are copy and paste code, you will see that they have a separate static variable I in that case. I don't have an example on the slide now. Right. Another new feature or a new type is the never type. And the never type basically indicates as a return type in a function that this function may never return. And when you do try returning from it, you will get an error. It is common to do this for functions like this, where we have like a function redirect, where we set our location header, and then we exit. So this can never execute, right? But it is also possible to follow the whole chain. So if we have redirect to login page, which basically does redirect for login, that you can also mark as never. And that is something that static analysis tools can make use of. And in this case, authors of the static analysis tools PHP Stan and Psalm have actually worked together of adding this feature added to PHP 8.1. Some remarks with the never type is like just like void, you can only use it as a return type, and I have to say it is a bottom type. Which means that in inherited methods, you can not widen the type. And you can't make it narrower because it is the bottom type. You can't get anything less than that. Let's have a look at class constants. Currently in PHP 8.0 and earlier, class constants are always overridable by child classes. So say we have the class universe, and we say final public const, you can in PHP 8.0 still override that, and in this case you can override the speed of light, which is a curious thing to do, of course. Now in PHP 8.1 you get to mark a constant as final, and that in that case you cannot override this constant in an inherited class. Pretty much behaves the same thing as your final methods, which you can't override in a inheriting class either. And of course it makes perfect sense not to be able to do that with constants. Now in this case you can see there's still drafts stamped through my slide, meaning that this feature hasn't made it into PHP 8.1 yet, but it has been voted on. And whether it actually makes it depends on implementation details. Something that isn't possible to do in PHP 8.0 and earlier is using null in new in constructors. So if you want to have a null logger, the only way how to set that is by creating a private property logger, making it nullable in a constructor, and having its default value of null. And then when the constructor runs, you check whether it's null, and if it isn't, and if it is null, then we do the instantiation of the new null logger. PHP 8.1 allows you now to do the new directly in the default value specification. So in this case, we say private logger logger equals new null logger. Now, you can't do everything with this new method, but you can do a few things. So you can use parameters in them as long as they are static values. You can't do any calculations in them. However, you can do another new, because that is also now considered as a static initializer. You can of course use name parameters that were introduced in PHP 8.0. But where else can you use them? Well, you can use them for static variables. You can now use new counter. Again, these static variables for functions I don't think are that useful, but looping back to a previous slide, you can actually do this if you want. You can use them as constants. In this case, we create a database link with the DSN for SQLite memory. Again, you can't use any dynamic calculations in here, but you can specify arguments. And it also means that this object gets instantiated when the class repository gets instantiated. And also interestingly, you can use them as arguments to attributes that were introduced in PHP 8.1. So this sort of allows you to do nested attributes because, as I mentioned, as arguments to this new initializer, you can use another new initializer. So basically you can do constraint new tries and then new whatever you can come up with and nest that deeply. So we don't actually have to add new syntax for having nested attributes. Because if you remember, arguments to these constraints are pretty much arguments to constructors. So you get the same thing here without adding extra syntax, which I'm always in favor of. All right, that was also still in draft, just as this new feature. Now in PHP, there's different ways how you can have like closures. In this case, we use two closure types here. We have the auto capture with single expressions. The single expressions are denoted by the event keyword, and then you map that with an arrow to a expression. This is a syntax that PHP's already had. Another syntax that PHP already had is the closure or the long closure that we have here, denoted by the function keyword without name, and then you have use, in this case, word characters. So the use is necessary here is because this long form of closures don't auto-capture variables from the outer scope, whereas the auto-capture with a single expression with the event keyword does do that. Now a long closure, denoted with function and the use word characters here, allows you to do multiple statements. But what you can't do is have a auto-capture taking up all the variables from the scope that the closure is defined in and have a list of statements like I'm doing here. PHP 8.1 is very likely going to get a combination of these, denoted by the fn keyword to denote auto-capture, and then using the syntax that we already had with the colon int curly open braces to then provide a list of statements. Now, originally, there wasn't really an intention about the event keyword meaning auto-capture, but by attaching these words or these concepts to a keyword, so we attach auto-capture to event and a single expression to the arrow operator, we now sort of have a reasonable syntax here, right? And a consistent syntax even by adding a new feature in here, which is the auto capture with statement list closures, which is quite a mouthful. Moving on. Let's have a look at properties. Now, in PHP 7.3 and earlier, if you wanted to make sure that all the values that you would set as name property meant that you had to use specific setter and getters here, because there was no way yet to define property types. So in 7.3, if you want to guarantee that, you need to use construct with the string keyword. The return type of getName, you have to define as string, and setName, to make sure that you have a string as a name, you have to specify the string keyword, the string type, as we have done here. Now in PHP 7.4, this is a bit easier because we started introducing the typed properties, so you can get away with only having it defined here. So now if you would assign whiskey name with a new value, PHP would already enforce that this is a string. And similarly, if you would read it, you can guarantee it was also a string. PHP 8 0 added on top of this the constructor property promotion, where you can specify the visibility inside the constructor arguments, and you end up with even less code now, right? But now a new constraint comes in saying that, oh, you need to make sure that the name can't be empty. And of course, with a type, you can't enforce that, or even worse, you need to make sure it's only read-only, because the class needs to do complicated calculations on them, and we don't really want inherited classes to set this. Now, in the PHP 7.3 case, where we had the set name and the get name method, that was of course easy, because you can then add that logic here. But we've gotten rid of this, and how do you now solve this, right? So the options is either putting the getters and setters back in, or using this get, set, and isset magic methods to, in combination by changing the property name back to private, so that get, set, and isset are called on this name, which isn't particularly very nice to do. First of all, the first one will break BC, but the second one doesn't, but it's still kind of ugly to have to do. Now, PHP 8.1 is likely getting a new feature, hence the draft on my slide again, is having specific property accesses. So you can specify behind the property visibility and type, in curly braces, the implicit property accessors, in this case get and set, meaning that this property can be both get and set from outside of the class, as well as inside. If you only use the get implicit property accessor, this means that this is now a read-only property. You can't call set on it, because this is gone. Or you can set asymmetric visibility, meaning that if you read the ABV property from anywhere, in this class as well as in other classes, you can do that, but you can only call set if you would do that on the same object, by having this asymmetric visibility by adding the keyword private to set. But you can actually do more. Instead of just having the implicit accesses get and set, you can actually give it a list of statements by using curly braces like I'm having done here. Well, in this case, you need to come up with your own backing of a property name, because name is now something that is managed by your class by having pretty much a get method on name and a set method on this name, but only for this property, which is distinct from having the get and set magic methods on the whole class, where you then have to check whether you're actually working on the right property first, which is not what you want to do here. So what I've done here now is I've done this implementation where basically you can call get and it will return a name, but when you do set, it also makes sure that the value isn't empty. And then we use the internal backing underscore name, which is private, which means you can't ever set it from outside of this class. And now, we can add these extra constraints at a later point when constraints to the business logic and application changes without having to reset to the setters and getters, which would break API, or using the underscore and the set and underscore get magic methods, which are quite a bit of a clutch, in my opinion. You can also use them in interfaces, and the interface specifies the minimum thing that you need to implement. So in our interface namer, we say that the property name needs to be able to get. But our implementation also allows us to set, which is fine, because the implementation allows more than the interface defines that there needs to be set. What you can't do is now set an implicit getter or set with the property name inside public here. There's also tricky bits with inheritance. You can actually override getters and setters like we have done here, which is good. So in this case, we've override the setter in the class single mult. And there's also now possibilities with variants. In PHP 8.0 and earlier, properties would always be invariant, meaning that you can't widen the type in an inherited class or narrow it. However, this changes if you have if you have properties that are not both get and set. If you have a get accessor only, meaning that you have a read-only property that you can't set, the properties actually become now covariant, meaning that in inherited classes you can actually narrow the type, which is what I've done here, right? Having gone from allowing an int and a string to something that is more narrow, which is a string. And then because this still follows the LSP rules, so you can do this. What you can also actually do, and that I don't really want to talk much about, is that you can also actually have set-only properties, which is kind of pointless, but if you would make one of these, you can actually have a contra-variant property in a inherited class where you get to widen the type. But however, set-only properties are a bit useless because you can never really quite read the value. So I don't really talk about that more than I have to. A few other smaller things that have been added to PHP are the Untitled date pattern generator. And the idea of this is as follows, right? For different cultures, you have different formats of how you want to do date formatting. So the Americans like using month, day, year, and Intel, which is part of the Intel extension, has like methods for this, or formatting ways for this. So the short format is 5, the month, and then, which is May, the day 31, and then the year 21. But it doesn't allow you to that you want the year in 4 digits, for example. Intel extension or ICU, which is this backing library, can't do this. Of course, you can do this manually by calling formats directly on the date time immutable class like I've done here for manual. But that causes a problem if you then change this to a different locale, for example, Italian. Because if we keep the same format for our manual thing, we get the 5/30/2021. Although what we really would have wanted is 30/05/2021. Which means you now have to create an implementation yourself for each of the locales that you want to support, which is kind of annoying because the whole idea of Intel and ICU is that it handles all these localizations for you. What has been proposed for PHP 8.1, and it has been accepted, it just hasn't been merged yet, which I expect to happen in the next week or so, is the new Untitled date pattern generator. And the way what it asks here is you can give it a skeleton. So the skeleton here says, I want a 4-digit year, a 2-digit month, and a 2-digit date. But the skeleton doesn't tell you in which order these things come in. That is now up to some internal ICU functionality which is going to be wrapped by the new Untitled date pattern generator that then creates a pattern for that in the locale that is being given. So for Italian you'll get, in this case, day, month, year, and for the US you'll get month, day, year by just switching the locale without having to change any other thing in the application. Which is great. Which is correct. I use the thinking thing because I don't think any date format that has the month first and the day second is actually a usable format. But we'll keep that for a different presentation. A few other things have been tidied up in PHP 8.1, which is changes to globals. So globals internally uses trick to make sure that if you change the global, your original value also gets changed. And it uses this internally by an indirect variable. So the globals array doesn't actually store the value for A directly, but it has sort of a pointer to it that points to the original A variable, which has the value 1, to make sure that you can do things like this. Globals are also by reference in a weird way that you don't expect of normal arrays. So if I assign globals to a non-special variable called globals in lowercase letters, and I modify the A on that, it will still reflect both in the globals as well as in its original variable, which is kind of odd. And by having to have this indirect variable, it actually complicates array accesses in PHP dramatically, because you have to check for every array access whether it's indirect or not. And that, of course, takes extra time. And that is all only necessary to make globals work the way it currently does in PHP. Now, Nikita Popov, the most prolific contributor to PHP at the moment, wanted to clean this up to make PHP go faster, which is what I support. So the change is pretty much that, like, writes to the globals array as a whole are no longer supported. So you can't assign a new array to it, you can't add elements to the whole array, but you can still modify internal, you can access variables in the globals arrays and override things. However, what also no longer works, and that is also what expected, is that if you have created, if you have initialized a variable, in this case lowercase globals, to the uppercase globals, modifying it in this new array that you've created won't modify globals anymore, which is what PHP standard behavior is, and hopefully also something that we want to do. PHP 8.0 introduces a new serializable mechanism that hopes to fix things in the serializable interface that we've had for a while now. Now, there's many problems with serializable. The main issues is that state needs to be kept in the serialization algorithm between nested classes. And it is really difficult to get that correct, especially when you have lots of nested classes with objects that you use more than once in them. I won't go into all the details because I'm not going to have the time for it, but trust me, there's a problem with this. There's also no requirement for what you use in serialize. Do you either use a single property or an array of properties, and so on and so on. PHP 7.4 introduces this new serializing mechanism through magic methods, which solves all of these cases. If you want to figure out what this is, find a presentation on PHP 7.4. But that means that we now have a way of getting rid of this weird and often broken serializing mechanism, but the serializable interface is now going to be phased out. So in PHP 8.1, we're starting the removal of this by only serializable classes. That means classes that only implement serializable, but not any of the magic methods. Either serialize or unserialize or sleep and wake up. So in PHP 8.1, implementing serializable will now throw a deprecation warning. And in PHP 9.0, which will be the next major version after PHP 8.1, there is likely going to be 8.2, 8.3, 8.4, and many in there, because we don't tend to break any functionality in minor versions. So this is only going to be removed in PHP 9, which is plenty of time from now. Another thing that's being tidied up is nulls to internal functions. strcontains wants two strings, and they're both typed as strings. But you can still pass a null, and that comes in from the time from when PHP internal functions had scalar types, and they have had that for a long, long time, since at least PHP 5.0. But you can still pass a null, because that's just the way how this worked, and you won't get a warning in this case. Of course, if you do this in userland, with the same implementation, you get a type error, because null, of course, doesn't match the string type hint, right? And you get this type error, which is what you expect. But this is a difference between internal functions and user functions, and we don't like differences for things that do the same thing. So what will happen in PHP 8.1 now is that we'll get a deprecation warning saying passing null to argument of type string is now deprecated. And then also in the next major version, PHP 9.0, this then turns into the same type error that you would have gotten for user implemented functions as well. We also tidy up something with incompatible floating point numbers when you convert those to integers. So in type coercive mode, which is not having strict defined as you can see here, if you pass in a floating point number to an integer, it auto converts this to an integer, and then when you do roundup of this, you get an integer. But this does mean that you can sometimes get data loss. Like if it's not a number, like not a number or infinity, or it is outside of the range for PHP integers, or it has a fractional part, you actually end up losing data, and that is not a great thing. So what PHP 8.1 will start to do is actually throw deprecation warnings for you, saying that there's an implicit conversion from a non-compatible float string, in this case 42.67, to the integer, and you get a deprecation warning for this, which I think is handy to find out bugs in your code. Now, of course, the big question is, when is PHP 8.1 going to be available? Now, the current release date is November 25th, 2021, which is what its current schedule says, but you know how these things go. So hopefully, maybe it comes out on this date. I've also have to mention that because feature freeze hasn't happened yet, some of these features might still change. And we might even get more new features that haven't been voted on or accepted yet, although I tried to cover the big ones during this past hour. But as I said, things might still change. Having said that, if you want to be kept up to date with all the developments in a PHP language, have a listen to PHP Internals News, the podcast, which you can also find on Spotify and iTunes, and there's an RSS feed as well, where you can, in weekly-ish episodes here from the actual contributors to the language itself. That's all I had to talk about. Are there any questions or queries? I think we can answer those in the chat. If that's everything, then I will publish these slides on my website, not website, at talks/php-phpday21, where you can then have a look at what I've spoken about in the last hour. Having said that, thank you very much, and I hope you learned a lot from this.
Thank you so much, Derick and Ada, apparently. That is so interesting and something I would really love to talk more about for a while, but we're tight for time. So we have a question in the chat, which we can certainly ask. So how does implicit property accessors tie together with the read-only property setup?
You'd expect them to work as it did before. There's no changes to anything here. It's a bit harder to explain more than that because the question is very concise, so I'm not quite sure the full details of what was being asked here. But I can answer it in the...
Yeah, it's from Kat, so you can answer in the chat also.
I will, yeah.
And yeah, just really quickly, are there any of those particular features that you're excited about personally?
I like the enums. I think fibers are interesting, but it is, as you have noticed, ridiculously complicated. Yeah. And I had to walk through this multiple times. I had to practice that quite well to explain what it is. But as I said, it is something that that will be implemented by like asynchronous frameworks for you. But it's good to know the background here. Yeah,
I think enums are going to be like a big deal, right? They'll touch a lot of areas of people's code bases, I would imagine. Whereas, fibers, I'm actually quite looking forward to getting my hands dirty and playing with them and trying to understand them. But I certainly did get a little lost there.
So the interesting thing is that in the week since I've made this presentation, there is 4 or 5 more new RFCs being put up. So there will be lots of extra new things, but I couldn't talk about that because I didn't know they were going to be submitted yet. So yeah,
that's all good.
Doing this in July would have been better.
Ardderchog, Derick. Diolch yn fawr. So yeah, we'll move on and let's say thank you to Derick and move on swiftly.
Bye.